Yes,
absolute nightmare.
that's me.
Yeah, yeah, true, true.
How are you,
Oh my
mate?
God. I'm good,
Listen,
I'm good.
I
But that
know
was
I
stressful.
understand, Instagram can be really flaky and the phones and all that,
Hmm.
but yours seemed like a very unusual problem taking us quite a bit.
You know what? My phone is a 7 Plus, and the latest update with Instagram doesn't enable the video
Huh.
messaging. On the 7 Plus, it's a bug. And so we had to go through all sorts. I'm on my wife's phone now. We had to swap the SIM cards over because I got two-step authentication and all the stuff to get around. It was a nightmare. But anyway, I'm here now. Thanks for letting me sign in as you.
Hey man, we get it done however we can manage it. Um,
That's the resilience of graffiti writers, the ingenuity. But I don't know. I was starting to question myself there for a second, man.
so, well, thank you, and again, welcome to the museum's artist talk. You are an exceptional artist. You are an ambassador of the culture, and we're so happy to have you on board. And before I begin, let me just set up the presentation so I can read a bit about you to folks and give them a little bit of background about you, okay?
Cool, awesome.
Let me just turn this around and bring this down and focus on this because we'll be looking at this. Ask You One. By the way, excuse me, let me just set this up. Ask You One. Elliot O'Donnell is a self-taught multidisciplinary artist hailing from the capital of the South Pacific, Auckland, New Zealand. From his roots in the city's graffiti scene during the 90s, he became one of the key figures known internationally from the region. Additionally, he has been an integral part of the scene throughout organizing Auckland's first graffiti festival, setting up multiple gallery spaces, and publishing both a magazine and a book showcasing New Zealand graffiti art. He's also directed over 30 music videos and many short documentary videos focused on local and international graffiti collaborations. Since 2010, Elliot has evolved his art practice more into the post-graffiti realm, focusing on studio work and large-scale outdoor murals. His work has progressed from text and portraiture-based paintings into a style he describes as portraiture by alternative means. That is part still life and part abstraction. He uses a combination of analog and digital techniques to create compositions made from 3D scans of random objects and textures from the street. He views these components as a recording of human movement through urban space, like a mass portrait versus one of an individual. Really exciting work, I will add, but let's start at the beginning. When you were a young man in Auckland.
Hmm.
And I generally ask this question to folks about their name, how we arrive at our names. And
Hmm.
you chose a name by definition, which means I didn't even know this ASKEW was a word, but by
Hmm.
definition, it's not in a straight level position.
Hmm.
Is that apt?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, you know how it is. It's like a balance of finding a cool word with cool symmetry, because obviously letter balance means something to us. So I really love the balance of it. I think that structurally an A and a W can be very balanced, and an S and an E can mirror each other, and a K to kind of break it up in the middle. And I always loved five letter names. The word, I didn't even really know what it meant when I picked it. I actually heard it in a lyric of a song.
Right. I saw, and you were all of 14 years old.
Yes, I was just, I mean, literally like a typical 14-year-old bonehead, smoking weed with my friends and drawing on paper, having little black book sessions or whatever. And I wrote, you know, probably about 10 different words at that point, and none of them stuck and none of them were very good. And we were listening to Freestyle Fellowship, their first album, Inner City Griots, and there was the lyric in Park Bench People, something is like, was like all askew like you or something. It was like the lyric, and I just remember, oh, that's really cool, askew, and I just started writing it on a piece of paper, and I loved it. I loved the balance, and so I stuck with it ever since.
But what got you into writing? What caught your attention at a young age of 14 that you wanted
Hmm.
to write your name?
Well, I feel like graffiti was very synonymous with growing up in my city, and a lot of people might find that surprising, considering it is a, you know, basically an island nation isolated in the bottom of the South Pacific Ocean. But we had a lot of strange kind of connections, to the US, mostly through our kind of Pacifica populations, like Polynesian people who were migrating around between the Pacific Islands, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. And they were definitely our culture bearers. And then, of course, the typical kind of media stuff. I mean, when Style Wars first aired on TV in New Zealand, we literally only had one TV channel back then. So
Wow.
when it played on the Sunday as a Sunday night documentary at 8:30 prime time, literally everybody in the whole country saw it, and the next day there were kids doing graffiti like that. But yeah, we have some strange connections that I mentioned. A lot of stuff, particularly in the era when I came up and was getting into graffiti, everybody was tagging. And it was a massive influence, not from the New York subway era, but more from the Los Angeles kind of gang graffiti. And a lot of it was from our Samoan and Tongan Mormon communities who were, going over there to do their mission and then taking photos of the graffiti over there and bringing that back as our culture bearers. And one name springs to mind. Is a guy called Fino from a crew called FDKNS, and he's sort of seen as kind of the godfather of a style of tagging that we refer to as straights in New Zealand, which is very much based on the gang graffiti of LA from around that time, late 80s, early 90s.
And so when you started writing and you're gathering all this information, who were the prominent writers and pioneers of
Mm.
um, of Auckland? Who could you name as?
Well, I mean, the earliest crew, they're actually featured in the Henry Chalfont and Jim Prigoff's spray can art book. They're a crew called Smooth Crew, or Smooth Incorporated, and they are like absolutely pivotal. They were really ahead of their time. They were at a level that I think a lot of countries outside of the US and even outside of New York City at the time, I think, they were at a level that a lot of people, it's surprising how good they were. Um, and when I'm originally from a smaller city called Palmerston North. And when I came to Auckland in '84 with my family, we more or less settled around the area where those guys were formed and very active. So, I had grown up seeing their stuff a lot, and it made an impression on me. But by the time I got into painting, the kind of New York influence, like, the New York subway kind of era influence graffiti had kind of died out, that influence in our city. And Smooth Crew had kind of stopped. They had a run of about kind of 4 or 5 years that they were really active. And then, they kind of went on to other things. And then we mostly had more of a tag banging kind of culture in that era. So I grew up looking at stuff like from crews like Ebony Society, ES, who were like a very, very prominent crew, like, in our city. Like any kid in our city will always kind of like say that they were a very big influence. And then there was a resurgence of people painting pieces in the kind of mid 90s, 94, 95, 96. And I think the crew that sort of needs to be mentioned is DAF crew, DAF, writers like Merkster, Aaron B, Tank, Dion,
And the
Booze.
acronym represents what? DAF.
It stood for Dope Ass Freaks.
There you go.
Or I think, they have, like they have a few different spins on it, so yeah.
Yeah. So at 14, so you were just kind of a kind of copycat, right? You
Oh yeah.
were definitely in that modality, right?
I mean, like I I just saw these guys who were kind of really active. Like there was a tunnel, it's called Combat Zone. It's like a tunnel that a lot of people painted. And it was right next to my mother's work. And I used to work there. My mom worked, she was a flower wholesaler, and I used to go and work, like push the trolleys and everything and help out on the auction. And I used to see like their stuff. I mean, like the first time I saw it, you know, they were painting in all of these kind of pastel colors that were really hard to get. They were using a lot of like shoe paint. There's a paint called Tucson and another brand called Tana. They're Australian paint brands. And they were using those colors. There were all these like denim blues and, you know, soft pinks. And, you know, it just looked so different to everything else, you know, out there at the time, which was mostly like black and silver, you know, or black and white. And, you know, I mean, New Zealand had a very limited kind of selection of paint, but these guys are kind of growing up between Australia and New Zealand and kind of had a little bit of knowledge about other things that they could use, and they tracked them down and did. And it just had such a huge impact on me. And I wanted to be exactly like them. I think everybody my age, you know, that grew up in our city kind of saw these writers and, you know, wanted to paint just like them.
So in Auckland, in your region, was there a transit system? Was it just wall painting, bus painting?
Well, that's an interesting story, actually. So Auckland at the time is kind of still, and it still very much is, a city that's growing into a major city. Like it's our largest city. It's got a population. It's got roughly just under half the country's population all live in this one city. But we always had a third world rail system. And it's actually a really important part of the story, actually, because so for understanding how our scene came to be, because the 87 stock market crash, right? It happened, and the countries that got affected really badly were New Zealand, Mexico, and Japan. And the recession that sort of came subsequently really created the foundation, you know, made our city, you know, what it is, and really conducive to like the graffiti scene that evolved. And the rail network's a huge part of it. So basically our government sold off like the rail infrastructure nationally to a consortium of merchant bankers, including a number in the United States. And they sold it for like $1 a year or something super crazy, some ridiculous amount, on the proviso that they were going to invest a huge amount of money into upgrading that infrastructure and providing jobs, which they didn't really. They ran the entire network into the ground.
Right.
And,
if I can interject for a second, the image that we're looking at, it looks, was that one of your local trains?
Well, that's actually a train. That's a commuter train, a long distance commuter train that ran between Masterton and Wellington, so our capital, which is down the other end of the North Island. But yeah, like the Auckland trains actually came out of a train museum in Perth. So they were already retired trains by the time we got them. They were super old. And they're kind of like more like a ridgy silver train.
Yeah.
Yeah, they basically only ran 6 days a week from 6 a.m. till 6 p.m. and never on Sundays.
Never.
So, you know, and there was literally a fleet of maybe about 10 trains. It was
so
like,
let me ask you this, as I look at the next image, and we're going to just kind of flip through some images with your style, because I'm always curious as how regional styles develop and what they're looking at. And clearly, as you mentioned before, you know, a lot of the influences that were coming from the States. How was it for you to try to distinguish yourself amongst those around you, you know, in terms of developing your style, your identity?
Well, for me, I mean, I think that I was early on, and you can kind of tell from this piece, I probably was trying to do something a little more in the fashion of like what, you know, more of a classic graffiti style. And because I was probably only about 18 or 19 years old when I painted that piece. And that's with a writer Webbs, who now writes bands. And he was really in that kind of vibe. Like he loved, he loved Sweat, he loved Cess, he like really looked to writers like that. And I was still trying to find my feet. And I think kind of afterwards, I started looking more to the European graffiti. And yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I see it in this piece, and this is why I highlighted it.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, in this one, it's interesting because I could see some of the West Coast influence, but also the European influence as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's painted in Dortmund with Atom, and he's an amazing writer from Germany. Obviously, like a lot of people probably know about him. He painted. We painted that wall in two phases. Like he painted the first version of it, like did both our names and his style, and then I came and kind of did this kind of rendered version of it, kind of almost like a kind of icing layer over the top. And yeah, we try to sort of just fuse it together in kind of interesting ways like that. But that's definitely kind of at a point where I was already kind of moving away from the kind of the 3D style that was really big,
It's interesting you say that because then the next several slides are very interesting to me in kind of the organic nature of your lettering, which in one sense have a sense of volume, right? And again, a departure from that one more so than this one, but a departure from the traditional format.
Well, you have to remember that the really influential writers of the day at that time were definitely Dime and Lumet. The Germans were really really prominent, and I think they were kind of responsible for kind of bringing a resurgence, of attention back to New York as well, and pushing the New York writers to kind of do something different. But Lumet, and Dime were two people that very early on I reached out to them. I invited them for this festival that I started organizing in New Zealand and brought them out. And then, of course, I just sponged every single bit of knowledge that I could get from them.
How old were you when you decided to do this festival, and why did you decide to do the festival?
Well, I was about 21 at the time, 20 or 21, yeah. And I guess my rationale was basically this, that I wasn't very good at saving money. I knew that I probably wasn't going to get to go and do a big travel overseas. But if I wrote a sponsorship proposal, I could possibly get somebody else to part with their money and bring people over, and then more people would get to benefit from that direct contact with the overseas artists. And it's one of those things that really propelled the New Zealand scene. It wasn't like something that, it wasn't my intention, but I think getting, our scene, we kind of got access to all our heroes in ways that even if you lived in the same city as these people, you may not have, because the allure of coming to a place so exotic like New Zealand, it was a massive draw card. And, it just...
And if you don't mind, what was the name of the festival?
So it was called Disrupt the System, which is, one of those typical kind of names you come up with when you're 20 years old, And it used to happen in Aotea Square, which is like the square in the center of Auckland City. And it later became part of a larger hip hop festival, like a kind of more four elements festival called the Aotearoa Hip Hop Summit, which was started by DJs Ali and DJ Severe. And they brought me on to coordinate the graffiti aspects of it.
Well, you also parlayed it into the magazine, the graffiti magazine Disrupt.
Yeah, well, my friend Pes5 from my crew and I, we set up a business when we were 22, kind of doing commercial mural work and everything, organizing the festival, and then we kind of made a foray into publishing, opened a gallery. We actually even set up a record label at one point. So yeah, we tried a lot of things.
I want to just kind of throw this out there because at the end of our talk, I want to highlight some of your wisdom about the galleries. I caught something online that was quite profound, and what I like is that at such a young age, you started thinking about that, about how to progress into the contemporary art scene.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I mean, even with all that going on and kind of trying to do enterprising projects, you would still keep bombing,
Mm-hmm.
regardless. On what were your aspirations, right? You know, outside of graffiti, because you're an active bomber, but at a young age, you're organizing, you're publishing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's weird. I think growing up in a place like New Zealand, like you start to feel kind of like if you don't initiate things, maybe they won't happen. You know, whereas, you know, like I spent the last 4 years living in New York, and it's just like it's a really easy place to get lost in all the noise, you know what I mean? But the cut through in a small place kind of makes it possible, you know, to do anything in a weird way and stand out. And I mean, I guess I'm ambitious. I mean, I did have a certain ambition, you know, and a certain drive, you know, and I wanted our scene to be really big, and I wanted it to be like recognized internationally because, you know,
Right.
like yeah, like when I was the first time I got on the internet, right? A friend of mine's father, like, you know, showed me the internet the first time when I was 16 or 17, and, you know, opened up like Netscape and told me to run a search, you know, type in a word of something you're interested in. I typed in graffiti and I found myself on art crimes. You know, being, you know, Susan Farrell's like
Yeah.
massive portal being
Susan
the
Farrell and Brett Webb. Yeah.
amazing because, and I went on there and I scrolled through the international section and I saw all the countries that were listed. And to my dismay, you know, New Zealand wasn't there. And I just thought, oh, you know, we have to be there. Like, we have to be up there. We have to be part of the world, you know, like people are forever, you know, you watch like news, like, you know, from overseas, and you'd see like maps of the world where our country's completely been omitted. Like, it's not even on the map. It's so small that no one even cares. So, you know, we've got this little thing, you know, like a, you know, maybe like a bit of a chip on our shoulder or something about that. And we, you know, it definitely fit into where my head was at that age. And I think in the 90s, like for us at least, I mean, I just saw people like what Diamond Luma and people like that were doing. They were organizing museum quality shows, like the
Yeah.
urban discipline shows. You know, they were painting commercial murals, you know, and then still painting, you know, like a train or something here and there, or doing some different stuff. Like you could be more general in that era, I think, which was kind of
Right.
cool.
And
Just,
at what point did you guys, or you and your crew,
mm,
decide to start the TMD, the most dedicated? I mean, because
mm,
that right at current, you have such a it's an international crew with some of the greatest writers like Can2,
mm-hmm,
and you know, Wow 123 is down with you guys, and
mm-hmm,
Adam and Addict and Acre. You have a good lineup, but
mm-hmm.
when did you start the crew, and who were the original members?
Yeah, I actually like I was part of not a, I wouldn't say a rival crew, but I was part of another crew. And TMD like started off in West Auckland. I'm from Central Auckland, and it was started by Charles Fat One Williams and Addict, as well as a bunch of other writers from West Auckland. They had all kind of come together through kind of like this big mural project. It was like a youth mural project, and all got to know each other. But and they were all hanging out, going to like gigs in the city, like club nights and things, and bombing together. But there were like 6 different crews, and they at some point just had a conversation and decided, you know, let's come together. Let's come together under one banner. So Addict came up with the name Maximum Dose, and Fat One was really more into 3-letter crew names. So he said, let's throw a T, you know, the Maximum Dose on the front. Um, there was a bit of enthusiasm at the beginning, but I guess kind of like some people stopped painting and other people went back to writing their other crew names, but Fat One really ran with it. And so for many years, it was kind of his crew, it was the crew that he built. Like he basically, you know, invited most of the original core members in. And at some stage, I guess we kind of like realized it had gotten big enough and enough people were invested in it that we made it a democratic kind of crew. So it's quite hard. It's become quite a hard crew to get into because, you know, like you have to have pretty much a unanimous vote from all the members, and there's like 23 people. So it's like, you know, it can be challenging, you know, but it's,
I guess I have no chance of getting in.
uh,
But
you know,
that said, my friend, what's interesting about this is that because you were curious about the well, you were concerned about your region not being acknowledged, and then it just starts getting acknowledged, and you think about your place in the international scene, and you team up with MSK, and that was huge for you because you could see in huge in that the influence of painting would start to rub off on you and your work.
Oh, most definitely. I mean, look, the first person from MSK I met was actually Ewok, and we became friends back in 2003. He came out to New Zealand. No, 2002. He came out to New Zealand for one of my festivals, and then he stayed for a bit longer. And I'd always been so fascinated, you know, with MSK and AWR. I was a huge fan of Crush and Tyke, and then obviously massive fan of Rhyme and Revoke. You know, I mean, there's so many good guys, you know. And in 2006, after I'd had a little bit of correspondence with Revoke and Rhyme already, we actually met at a festival out in Brighton, in England. And you know, you know, you don't sometimes you kind of build people up in a way that you don't really like kind of even think that they're like will be relatable, you know, or even that in my mind like Revoke was like 10 years older than me or something, you know, and to find that, you know, we're only a couple of years apart and me and Ryan are the exact same age, and we all just kind of clicked straight away. And it was a few years before I got down with the crew, before I got invited, and I got put down in 2012 out in Detroit. And by that time, I'd been hanging out with those guys, you know, for years, making regular travels out to the United States. I had them come and stay with me a couple of times in New Zealand, and you know, we're all kind of on a. It was a cool time. It was exciting. You know, I did some road trips across the United States. You know, with Revoke and Zess and Auger and Next, rest in peace. You know, and just started to kind of get to know everybody. And, you know, everyone was like so motivated during that moment. You know, everyone was just pushing everybody. And
well, you definitely were pushing the boundaries of painting and letter-based painting, as we see here. And, you know, this is interesting because these are kind of bevel cut pieces in a way. And tell me about the development of this style, because again, it's a big departure from what you were painting back home.
Well, it's kind of like an integration of like all of the different threads, you know, like I went from traditional letters, working out how to do them, to painting like three-dimensional letters and more rendered techniques, to kind of working my way back towards traditional letters, and then thinking about incorporating some of those 3D techniques, like still having a structurally strong piece. Like my intention has always been to do something that's kind of challenging and new and uses new techniques, but I still want an old school New York writer to look at it and say, I can see strong letters there, and this is, you know, has structure, you know. Because I think that during the late 90s and early 2000s, a lot of people started to really kind of criticize, you know, the big movement towards kind of 3D graffiti, or graffiti that, you know, resembled something else, you know, or anti-style graffiti or whatever, that it was deviating too far from the kind of original purpose. And the way I see it is, you know, that maybe there was a way to kind of like do both, you know, and to kind of please kind of, you know, to please everybody, I guess, in, you know, in a way. Probably
Right.
one of my biggest pushes, you know, was my partnership with Burst, you know, who I, you know, is a younger writer than me from my city. Probably I would put him in my top 10 graffiti writers worldwide. And when we came together and started painting, was probably at a time where I probably easily could have stopped painting. Like I was kind of like getting pulled away towards other things, you know, like running my business and doing all that sort of thing.
Were you at that point doing the music videos?
Yeah, I mean, like the music videos, yeah, I've had a few different careers that have kind of potentially pulled me away from my art, you know, or I thought, okay, it's just time to go full force into like the gallery thing, or you know, it's time to focus on my commercial art, or you know, maybe I have an agency or run a gallery, or I've tried all these other things. But you know, like I was definitely at one of those crossroads when him and I started painting, and he just gave me an injection of enthusiasm. Like end up painting the best graffiti of my life with this guy, because um, just having that young energy in somebody who's trying to push the boundaries on every single level, you know, and he's still, you know, was super active. Like he was just
Yeah.
like painting freights every fucking day, you know, like he'd be on a police curfew and he'd still paint like a whole freight before, you know, 9 p.m. and be back before the cops came to check on him. Like he just, you know, he just got that, he has that energy, you know.
The
But he,
fever. One of the
mm-hmm,
things that's interesting to me, and these are all quite beautiful, I'm going to say, but this one, I am so attracted to this. Um, uh, and this seems like a more contemporary piece. Am I
mm-hmm.
correct?
Yeah. Yeah, it's more recent, and that's a piece for Ewok. So as I mentioned, like I've known him for a super long time. One of the things that Burst really tried to encourage, you know, at a certain point was rather than writing our own names, writing other people's names really
Yeah.
often, as a tribute to people that have been good to us or people we admire, respect, or as an exchange, you know, which was kind of the concept that Brian came up with. Um, we're just kind of getting away from our own egos, you know, like that was something that we were really interested in, is kind of like graffiti is just so sort of egocentric and just thinking about other ways of kind of doing this, you know, like showing gratitude to somebody else is who's had an influence in you is such a nice thing to do, you know.
Yeah, that's one of the things I like about the culture, that there's more of that happening. I mean, that
Mm-hmm.
did happen somewhat in the early days, but not to the extent it's happening now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's wonderful. Again, one of the things as a style writer, one of the things that I really thoroughly enjoy about this culture, it's the constant innovation,
Mm-hmm.
both in the letter forms, but also the painting, but also in the scale, right? One of the things I like about your painting is scale.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do, it's different when you do a so-called traditional mural that is either figurative or graphic, but the impact of large graffiti paintings,
Mm-hmm.
like they were on the train, but that now you do them probably twice the size.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I realized like pretty quickly when I started traveling in New Zealand, we tended to be a little bit stingy, you know, with our paint back in the day, because we're such an isolated place that things were kind of rare, you know. There was a sort of scarcity to the materials. And when I started traveling, I just kind of realized, I mean, obviously I was meeting a lot of people who were sponsored, you know, and so they were able to be like a little bit more bold with how they use their paint, like kind of paint like they didn't care about, you know, running out of a particular color or whatever. And I realized that, I mean, I was very impressed by that, you know, especially in my, you know, late 20s or whatever. So when I came back, and not long after, you know, I eventually ended up getting a sponsorship from Ironlac, and it sort of opened up those possibilities for me to work bigger and bigger, you know, but also just, you know, spending days on a piece. Like a lot of people don't like doing that. But for me, it's like, I do like to spend sometimes a whole week. Like that one you're showing now, I went and spent like maybe 3 or 4 hours a day over the course of a week, you know, working on it and just kind of fleshing it out as I go, just freestyling. And you know, it's it's a really pleasant way for me to paint. I've always kind of been more towards the artistic side of graffiti. I've definitely done my fair share of like, you know, illegal stuff, but even then, I always wanted to push the boundaries of what could be done creatively.
In terms of you know, first of all, you had an interest in graffiti, but outside of that, you mentioned that you were interested in you know, having a design studio, and what was your interest in graphic design or typography? Because I find it really interesting that as wild as this is, you were also experimenting with typography and graphic design.
Yeah, well, there's actually a long tradition of typography in like New Zealand contemporary art, particularly amongst a lot of the Maori contemporary artists. So a lot of those artists that I really liked, you know, they basically like Ralph Horteri, like through to like Shane Cotton, um, you know, they just always had typographic elements and words, you know. And so when I started making a segue into making more like, you know, contemporary art, I really felt like that was a good springboard and a natural springboard coming from both a graphic design background and a graffiti painting background. And I felt like it honors a particular tradition in our country.
This one helped stuck in this crazy island.
Yeah.
What was this all about?
You know, like I used to feel a lot that isolation of being in New Zealand and sort of feeling like, you know, I was missing out on everything else that was happening around the world. You know, I painted that phrase a few times, you know, in a few different iterations because I really felt it. I had a real FOMO, a real sense of missing out, seeing my friends do big, crazy things overseas and having so much opportunity. It's funny in the post kind of COVID reality, how good New Zealand's looking right now. So it's weird. It's a grass is greener type thing, I guess, you know.
Isn't it? I mean, and you continue using typography, but in a different context now. You're deviating from graffiti altogether in this one. Tell me about this mural and why you took this direction.
So when COVID actually happened, and I was so basically I was living in New York City for 4 years with my wife. We, you know, were still very dependent on me traveling for our income. And that's been my kind of main mode, is like painting murals or kind of on a sort of mural festival circuit or whatever for the last decade. So at a drop of a hat, I was always ready to jump on a plane and go somewhere and paint, you know, for our money. And the opportunity came to go back home to New Zealand to paint a couple of murals right as kind of the whole COVID thing was kind of unfolding in New York. You know, New York went very quickly from 2 cases to 180 cases to close to 1,000 cases, and the time between when I got offered to come do the job, when I decided to go, jumped on a plane, and by the time I arrived in New Zealand, I had a grim feeling that I was going to get stuck in New Zealand, and I did. I got stuck there for 3.5 months because they completely closed the border, and my wife was stuck in New York. We had a very strict lockdown. I know that in some states in the US, they did try that early on to like shelter in place, but it didn't really kind of hold because Americans don't really like doing what they're told. But in New Zealand, we're pretty compliant culture, and it's a small place with only 5 million people, so we feel a little more invested in each other. And so we had a 5-week lockdown period where we were only allowed within a 2-mile radius from our houses. They closed all businesses except for absolutely essential. So basically grocery stores, pharmacies and gas stations. And I was at home. I wasn't able to go to my studio because I still keep a studio in New Zealand to work on my art. So I started working digitally again on my iPad, and had to kind of come up with a complete different modality, you know, to like making images. So I started using Forger, which is a 3D modeling software. It's much like modeling with clay, and just making these really extreme kind of impossible sculptures, and then painting them with the ZBrush, and then taking them into Procreate and painting in the backgrounds, and then basically glitching them out with this other app that I have. And I came up with a study every day. It was just sort of my goal to kind of keep my sanity through the lockdown. And so I made 50 of them. And then they kind of became the basis for my next set of paintings and murals.
Right.
And that was, yeah.
And to interject for a second, you know, this particular, the background illustrates this. Of course, you know, symbiotic, you know, of course, given that everything was shut and closed. I mean, that's a very good term to be using.
Yeah.
And of course, it's interesting to me, you know, in terms of how we are responding to COVID, right? And what it takes, you know, and we don't know where it comes from. I'm going through that process right now in my own work. That's such a deviation as a response. And there's something liberating about departing from your normal way of working and thinking to address things in public space, right? And you continue to do that with this new style. Even with this one, it says everything. I don't know if people can read that, but this was the setup for what was to come.
Yeah, I mean, literally, I was maybe 3 days into that mural when they closed the border, and then it was kind of like the situation of kind of like we were suddenly kind of having to rethink everything. You know what I mean? I was realizing very quickly like how dependent I was on the ability to travel, you know, consistently and able to just go to any country at the drop of a hat, even though that was starting to not really align with my ethics, my personal ethics around sustainability. And I was realizing, you know, this whole time that I needed to get more situated in one place and just kind of calm down and focus. But then when it happened, when COVID completely came through and it's so disruptive, you know, to all of our kind of, you know, distribution networks and our methods of travel and our means of commerce and kind of all these things, you know, not to mention, you know, the fact that, you know, so many people have died. Yeah, I just realized how not robust.
Yeah, I'm glad you're pointing this out because for those people out there who will watch this, I think it's important to illustrate, you know, how this affects an artist and an artist's livelihood and their family and their community, especially those of us who are in this genre, right? Because it's so community-based in many ways. And, you know, the opportunities are sort of like not there anymore. The institutions and the galleries are scarce. So that is, you know, psychologically, physically, financially, all so burdening.
It is, and it's a challenge, you know, but it's a challenge I think that we're able to rise up, you know, and kind of like think innovatively, you know, the way that we do, especially in graffiti. We are resilient, you know, and we are survivors. We're the cockroaches, you know, of the art industry, you know.
Well, you know what's interesting, because people have also, you know, asked about the museum. Or you guys open? You know, we shut down for a bit, but we figured it out. We worked within the constraints. We kept programming and we kept reaching out to the community. And what's important about what the museum represents is that it illustrates that there is this other economy that's built into our culture that's not dependent on the economy of the art market or the, you know, the Sotheby's and Christie's of the world.
Yeah.
It's itself, you know, that's the nature of hip hop, right? That kind of self-sustaining system, it's built into it. You have enough of a big fan base that they will still buy your prints, your paintings, or t-shirts, if that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like my graffiti people have shown up, you know, time and time again for me, you know, and proven, you know, like the people that have known me for all this time, you know, all the supporters, you know, like COVID has really shown that, you know, like because, you know, we're like 9 months in now, and you know, I've been back in the US like almost 6 months, and it's pretty impossible for me to work here the way that I was. And, you know, obviously I have a very restrictive visa, like I'm here to do a particular thing.
Do you want to stay in the US?
I mean, it's really hard, you know, I'm conflicted every day, you know what I mean? because, you know,
that makes two of us.
yeah, yeah. Essentially, like home is always looking really good, but I am married. I have family here now, and other people to think about. And as I watch the sort of political instability of this country, kind of, and everything that's been transpiring there, and then plus COVID, and it just seemed like such a powder keg, you know, like a real tinderbox, you know, and so far, I mean, there's a lot of bad shit has happened, but I think the worst has sort of mostly been averted, you know, which is really positive, you know. But I think that the United States as a society has to go through a very introspective time right now and kind
Yeah.
of really assess. I mean, the United States has always had a very interesting relationship with fascism, right from its inception. You know what I mean? This
Well,
concept.
we have a very strong market for it in our entertainment industry.
Hmm.
It,
Yeah,
it's fascinating.
it
So
is.
listen, without getting too political, as we
Hmm.
wind down, because this is going to be part one. Since we started late, I'm going to start again with you. So
Yep.
I'll need everybody to hold on while I'll save this portion of our talk, because I want to delve into your studio practice and where you are now.
Okay.
So again, let me just switch this over. Um, so you see my mug. So you know, on behalf of the museum, I want to thank you for taking this time with us, and I'll join you on the other side of this. All right?
Okay. Cool.
Perfect.